Story 1, The Forest of Laments. Welcome to a new journey, where the silence of nature hides ancient and unexplored secrets. Today, we will follow a group of adventurers who dare to enter a forgotten forest, where laments echo through the wind. What will they find? What truly lurks in the shadows? Close your eyes and prepare to meet the Forest of Laments. The call of the forest. Pedro and his friends were known for seeking out unusual adventures. They had already climbed mountains, explored caves, and braved dense forests. But this time, something was different. They had heard of an ancient forest, avoided by locals due to a disturbing legend. They said the forest was alive and that those who heard its laments never returned. Convinced it was just a superstition, Pedro and the group prepared for the expedition. Equipped with their backpacks and cameras, they set out into the forest, unaware that they were about to enter something far beyond what they imagined. As they crossed the boundary of the forest, the air changed. It wasn't the usual silence of tall trees, it was a suffocating silence, as if even the wind was afraid to venture there. Pedro was the first to notice, but he said nothing. As they moved deeper, the laments began. At first, they were just distant noises, but soon they became clear, cries of pain and despair. The following laments. Hours passed, and the forest seemed larger than anyone could have imagined. No known trail, no visible exit. It was as if the forest itself was moving around them, making them lose their sense of direction. Pedro began to see figures in the shadows, as if the laments were accompanied by invisible presences. Pedro's friends started changing. Ricardo, the most fearless of the group, began to stray farther away, saying he needed to explore something he had seen. When he disappeared into the darkness of the forest, they heard his scream echo. They tried calling out, but there was no response. The silence returned, and Pedro realized that the forest was taking them, one by one. The laments grew louder at night, making it impossible to sleep. Pedro saw his friends muttering strange words in their sleep, as if they were being influenced by some dark force. They were slowly becoming part of the laments, as if the forest was absorbing them. The fight for survival. Pedro realized he needed to escape quickly, but his friends were no longer willing to listen. They seemed trapped by the forest, as if they had already become part of it. The laments now called out to him by name, begging him to join them. The night grew more oppressive, and Pedro knew he didn't have much time before he too was consumed. He tried to leave alone, but the forest seemed endless. The trees moved, paths disappeared, and the feeling of being watched intensified. One night, he stumbled upon a clearing where a hooded figure awaited him. The figure, with a deep, ancient voice, revealed itself as the guardian of the forest, tasked with collecting souls to maintain the balance of the land. Pedro had to make a choice: accept his fate and become part of the laments, or fight to escape, knowing that it might cost him more than just his freedom. The final choice. Determined to escape, Pedro confronted the guardian. However, as he tried to fight, he realized the forest was alive. The trees moved, the ground trembled, and the laments turned into deafening screams. He ran as fast as he could, but the guardian and the shadows followed closely behind. Just as he was about to give up, he saw a faint light in the distance, the exit. With all the strength he had left, Pedro managed to cross the boundary of the forest, but not without paying a price. His friends were left behind, their voices now mixed with the eternal laments. And Pedro, though he had escaped, knew the laments would follow him. Wherever he went, he would always hear the cries of those the forest had taken. Story 2, The Cursed Mirror. There are objects that carry more than just their form. Some say mirrors reflect not only what's in front of them but also what was and what will be. Today, you will hear the story of a cursed mirror, where reflections hide something deeper, and much more dangerous. The mysterious mirror. Mariana, a collector of antique objects, found a peculiar mirror in an antique shop. The vendor, an elderly man with a mysterious expression, warned her not to buy it. "It carries a curse," he said. But Mariana, skeptical, took the object home, thinking the old man only wanted to scare her. However, as soon as the mirror was placed in her living room, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small movements in her reflection that she thought were optical illusions. But as days passed, Mariana noticed something more disturbing. The reflection in the mirror didn't follow her movements precisely. There was a slight delay, and sometimes, the reflection seemed to have a life of its own. Dark reflections. One night, while observing the mirror, Mariana saw a shadow pass behind her reflection. She quickly turned around, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, she noticed her reflection was smiling, but she wasn't. Fear began to take hold of her, and with each passing day, the mirror seemed more alive, more oppressive. Mariana began having recurring nightmares, where she was trapped inside the mirror, banging desperately on the surface, trying to get out. The nights became unbearable, with whispers coming from the mirror, calling her name. She tried covering it with a cloth, but every time she woke up, the cloth had mysteriously fallen. The curse revealed. Desperate to understand what was happening, Mariana began researching the mirror's origin. She discovered it had belonged to a woman named Isabel, who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. They said Isabel had become obsessed with the mirror, believing it showed more than reality, that it was a door to another world. Mariana realized that the mirror's curse was repeating itself with her. The more she looked into the mirror, the more trapped she felt. The figure in the mirror, now clearer and more distinct, was Isabel, and she was trying to trade places with Mariana. That night, as Mariana stared into the mirror for the last time, she saw Isabel smile as her own image began to fade away. The encounter with the reflection. Knowing her time was running out, Mariana tried to destroy the mirror. With a hammer in hand, she struck the surface, but the glass didn't break. Instead, the mirror absorbed the force, and Isabel's figure stepped out of the reflection, now standing beside Mariana. "Finally," said Isabel with a cold, dark voice. In one last desperate attempt, Mariana ran toward the mirror, but it was too late. Isabel pulled her inside, and now Mariana was trapped in the reflection, looking out at the world as Isabel took over her life. And so, the mirror's curse continued, waiting for its next victim. Story 3, The Whispers of the Library. Books hold stories. But what if some books held more than just words? Something forgotten and dark, hidden between the lines. Today, you will hear about a library where the whispers of its pages carry secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. The Forbidden Book. Carlos was a historian obsessed with ancient civilizations and their secrets. One day, he was invited to visit a private library hidden in the heart of an ancient city. The library, filled with rare books, had an aura of mystery, and the librarian warned him not to touch the books in the forbidden section. Curious, Carlos couldn't resist. He found a book hidden on a shelf, with no title or identification. The book seemed to have its own energy, and as soon as he opened it, he felt a chill run down his spine. The pages were filled with symbols and words in a language he couldn't understand, but as he tried to decipher them, he heard whispers coming from the pages. Ancient secrets. Carlos spent hours analyzing the book, but with each page he turned, the whispers grew louder and clearer. They spoke of an ancient civilization that had practiced black magic, using the books as portals to other dimensions. He began having visions, scenes of dark rituals and sacrifices, as if the book was showing him the past. The visions intensified, and Carlos began seeing shadows moving in the library, creeping between the shelves. The voices were now in his mind, demanding that he complete what the ancient civilization had started. He knew he was dealing with something dangerous, but his curiosity wouldn't let him stop. The dark revelation. Carlos discovered that the book was a kind of guide for summoning beings from another dimension. The ancients had tried to use the book to bring these creatures into the real world but failed, resulting in the destruction of their civilization. Now, the whispers wanted Carlos to complete the ritual and release the beings. He tried to get rid of the book, but every time he threw it away, it mysteriously reappeared. The book had chosen him, and now he was trapped in a cycle of nightmares and visions, where the creatures watched him from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to cross the barrier between worlds. The final ritual. Desperate, Carlos decided to perform the ritual. He believed it was the only way to end the whispers and regain his sanity. However, as he recited the final words, he realized the mistake he had made. The shadows around the library began to move, gaining form and life. The creatures were free, and Carlos knew there was no turning back. The last words he heard before being consumed by the shadows were the whispers from the book, laughing at his foolishness. Story 4, The Midnight Visitor. They say that at midnight, the barriers between our world and the unknown become thinner. And it is at this moment that he appears. He doesn't knock, doesn't make a sound. He's just there, waiting. This is the story of a visit no one wants to receive. The mysterious visitor. Joanna had always had nightmares about a man in a black suit who appeared by her bedside at midnight. The man had a pale, expressionless face and always approached her while she was paralyzed in the dream. However, on the night of her 30th birthday, the nightmare became real. At midnight, Joanna woke up and saw the man standing in the corner of the room. He didn't move, just watched her. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. When the clock struck 12:01, the man vanished. The visits repeat in the days that followed. The man returned at the same time, every night. Always standing in the same corner, silently watching her. Joanna locked all the doors and windows, tried to ward off the presence, but nothing worked. He was always there, at midnight, and each time he appeared, he seemed closer. She began to research the man and discovered he was known in local legends as the Visitor. Those who saw him were marked by a curse, and their fate was sealed. Joanna began to have vivid nightmares where the man spoke to her, telling her that her time was coming. The final encounter. On the final night, Joanna decided to confront the visitor. At midnight, she was awake, waiting for him. When he appeared, she confronted him, asking what he wanted. The man, with a cold, emotionless voice, said, "It's time." Joanna tried to run, but the doors to her room were locked. The man approached slowly, and when he finally reached out to touch her, everything went dark. The dark revelation. Joanna woke up in a completely different place. The world around her was distorted, twisted, like a living nightmare. The visitor was beside her, and now she understood. She was trapped in his realm, a place where time and reality no longer existed. And there, she would be his companion, forever. Story 5. The Shadow in the Room. Sometimes, shadows appear where they shouldn't be. And not all shadows come from light. This is the story of a shadow that appeared in Lucas's room, and the terror it brought with it. The inexplicable shadow. Lucas was a photographer, used to observing the smallest details around him. One night, while reviewing photos in his room, he noticed a shadow in the corner that didn't seem to come from any object. At first, he thought it was just a strange reflection, but the more he looked, the more the shadow seemed to take shape. In the following days, the shadow continued to appear in the same corner, even with all the lights off. It didn't move, but Lucas felt like he was being watched. When he tried to ignore it, strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, and he heard whispers coming from that corner. The shadow takes shape. As the days passed, the shadow began to change. It seemed to grow, expanding across the walls of the room. Lucas tried covering the corner with furniture, but the shadow always found a way to project itself. He began having nightmares, where the shadow came to life and suffocated him, draining his energy. Lucas decided to investigate the house, thinking there might be a logical explanation. However, when researching the history of the house, he discovered that the former resident had mysteriously disappeared. Now, Lucas was sure the shadow was the soul of that man, trapped in the room. The confrontation with the shadow. Determined to rid himself of the shadow, Lucas tried using bright lights to dissipate it. But the more he fought it, the stronger the shadow became. It now covered almost the entire room, and Lucas could barely breathe in the oppressive environment. In a last attempt, Lucas turned on all the lights in the house, but the shadow remained. Then, in desperation, he approached the shadow, and for the first time, it moved toward him. The end of light. Lucas tried to run, but the shadow engulfed him completely. He felt his energy being drained, and in his final moments, he heard the whispers say, "Now you are part of me." When Lucas's friends found him days later, the room was empty, except for the shadow, now even larger, waiting for its next victim. Story 6. The Locked Room. Some doors should never be opened. This is the story of a woman who discovered the secret of a locked room in her house, and the terrible price she paid for it. The mysterious door. Anna inherited a house from her late aunt, a large mansion in the countryside. The house was old and full of secrets, but the most intriguing one was a locked door on the top floor. Her aunt had left her clear instructions: never open that door. Intrigued, Anna tried to ignore the locked room, but her curiosity grew by the day. She searched for keys all over the house, but none seemed to fit. At night, she began hearing whispers coming from behind the door, as if someone was calling her name. The room revealed. After weeks of searching, Anna finally found a key hidden inside one of her aunt's books. With both fear and excitement, she decided to open the door. As she turned the key, a shiver ran down her spine. The room was completely preserved, as if no one had entered it for decades. However, something was wrong. In the center of the room, on the bed, was a figure, a silhouette covered by a white veil. Anna slowly approached, and as she lifted the veil, she saw her aunt's face, but decomposed, as if she had been dead for much longer than time had passed. The room's curse. Anna ran out of the room, locking it again, but the whispers continued, now louder and more persistent. She knew she had unleashed something by opening the door and that she was now trapped in the same curse that had consumed her aunt. That night, the dreams began, visions of her aunt repeating the words, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Days passed, and Anna began to see shadows moving around the house, always heading towards the locked room. She tried to leave, but she always ended up back at the room, with the key in her hand. The house wouldn't let her go until the cycle was complete. The cycle repeats in the end. Anna resigned herself to her fate. She knew the curse of the locked room would never end. As she opened the door for the last time, she lay down on the bed, waiting for her aunt's figure to take her. And so, the cycle repeated itself. The house now awaited the next heir, the next curious soul who dared to open the locked door. Story 7, The Phantom Train. Some journeys have no return. And some stations should never be reached. Today, we will tell the story of a train that appears only on special nights, a train that never stops, and never reaches the right destination. Close your eyes and prepare to embark on a one-way journey aboard the Phantom Train. The abandoned station. Miguel always had a fascination for places forgotten by time. In search of his next photographic adventure, he discovered an abandoned train station on the outskirts of a small town. The locals avoided talking about the station, as if there was something dark and unwanted about it. He decided to explore the place at night, thinking the absolute silence would help him capture the forgotten essence of the location. When he arrived at the station, he saw what remained of the rusty tracks and crumbling platforms. It was hard to imagine that decades ago, the place had been full of life. But something strange happened while he was taking pictures. The air grew heavy, and in the distance, Miguel heard the sound of a train. Confused, he looked around. The tracks had been out of service for years. Even so, the sound grew closer. The train's arrival. Miguel stood on the platform, watching the abandoned tracks. And then, to his surprise, a train appeared. It was old, completely black, with fogged windows. The train stopped at the station, but there was no one inside, no sound except for the screeching of the rails. The doors slowly opened, as if the train was inviting him to board. Against his better judgment, Miguel decided to enter. As he stepped through the doors, the air inside the carriage was cold and dense. The seats were covered in dust, and the lights flickered faintly, creating an even more sinister atmosphere. As he walked through the aisles, he felt a presence watching him. The train began to move, despite no one being in control. The dark destination. As the train sped up, Miguel tried to look out the window, but the outside scenery was completely unrecognizable. There were no trees, buildings, or lights, only an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything around. The sound of the wheels on the tracks was deafening, and the sense of unease grew with each second. As he explored more carriages, Miguel found something even more disturbing: passengers. Immobile figures, sitting in the seats, dressed in clothes from past eras. Their faces were turned toward the windows, but there was no life in them, as if they were wax statues. When he approached one of the passengers, the figure slowly turned its head and looked directly at him. Miguel ran to the back of the carriage, but it seemed like the train had no end. Each door he opened led to another identical carriage, filled with motionless passengers. The presence he had felt grew closer, as if it was about to catch him. The price of the journey desperate, Miguel ran back to the train's entrance, but the door was locked. The train now seemed out of control, speeding at an impossible rate. When he looked out the window again, he saw something that paralyzed him. The train was moving through an endless void, floating on non-existent tracks. Then he saw it. The figure that had been following him all along revealed itself. The train's conductor, a cadaverous-looking man, approached him with a twisted smile. "Welcome to the final station," said the figure, as the entire carriage dissolved into darkness. Miguel was never seen again. The train, as always, disappeared into the night, waiting for its next passenger. Story 8, The Cliff House. Some houses are meant to be left alone. This is the story of an isolated house, built on the edge of a cliff, where the furious waves of the sea are not the only thing to fear. What lurks within the walls of that house is far more dangerous. Prepare to meet the Cliff House. The mysterious inheritance Sarah received the unexpected news that she had inherited a property from a distant relative she barely knew. The property was a large stone house built on a cliff overlooking the sea. Fascinated by the idea of living in such a picturesque place, she decided to move immediately, without thinking about the stories the townspeople told about the house. Upon arrival, she was impressed by the view. The vast ocean stretched out before her, waves crashing violently against the rocks below. But the house, though imposing, had a dark air. It was old, full of empty rooms and hallways that echoed with the sound of the wind. On the first night, Sarah heard strange noises coming from upstairs. Thinking it was just the wind, she ignored it, but the sounds persisted, knocking, footsteps, and occasionally the sound of something scratching the walls. The house's secrets. As the days passed, Sarah began to explore the house, trying to familiarize herself with every corner. However, she always felt like she was being watched, as if the house was alive. One day, while opening one of the old cabinets, she found a collection of hidden letters, all written by someone who seemed to have lived in the house long ago. The letters spoke of a presence on the cliff, something that came with the most violent tides, seeking something that had been left behind. Each time she read the words, Sarah felt the atmosphere around her change. The house seemed colder, more oppressive, and the knocking on the walls grew more frequent and intense. The presence on the cliff that night, a violent storm hit the coast. The waves crashed against the rocks so hard that the house shook. Sarah heard the knocking again, but this time it was louder, as if someone was trying to get in. When she looked out the window, she saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the cliff. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the sense of danger remained. Sarah tried to leave the house, but the doors were locked, and the howling wind made it impossible to see the path outside. The knocking began again, this time coming from within the walls. Sarah began to feel as though something was trying to reach her, as if the walls were closing in around her. She knew the house held a dark secret, something that had been buried and forgotten, until now. The final secret desperate, Sarah returned to the cabinet where she had found the letters. At the bottom, there was one last letter, which spoke of a pact made between the house's former owner and the spirit of the cliff. The pact required a sacrifice, something where someone had to be offered for the spirit to leave the house in peace. When Sarah finished reading, she heard the basement door creak open with a long, agonizing sound. Knowing she had no choice, she descended. At the bottom of the basement, she found what was left of the old resident, their body consumed by the forces they had invoked. The spirit now demanded a new sacrifice, and Sarah knew she was next. The waves crashed violently against the cliff, and the house seemed to shrink around her. When Sarah finally met the spirit, a hooded figure in the dark, it whispered, "Welcome to your new home." And so, the house gained a new inhabitant. Story 9, The Asylum of the Forgotten. There are places that hold stories time tried to erase, but some marks are too deep to disappear. Today, we will venture into an old asylum where the patients weren't just forgotten by the world, but by themselves. Their memories, their voices, lost. And what remains there still roams the halls, waiting for someone who can hear them. The Dark Call Carlos was an amateur investigator of abandoned places. His interest had always been exploring old buildings, taking photos, and uncovering their stories. One day, he heard about an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of a small town. It was said that the place had been closed down in the 1970s after a series of unexplained incidents involving the patients. When he arrived at the asylum, Carlos noticed that the building was almost completely hidden by vegetation. It was an imposing structure with tall walls and windows covered in dust. The place had a heavy atmosphere, as if nature itself wanted to bury it. He entered through the old doors, which groaned under the weight of the years. The smell of mold and decay was strong, and the echo of his footsteps reverberated through the empty corridors. As he explored the first few rooms, Carlos found scattered patient files, all damaged by time. There was something strange about the records. Many names were crossed out, as if someone had tried to erase them from history entirely. He took a few photos and kept walking. Soon, he heard a distant sound, like rhythmic knocking. It seemed to come from the upper floor. Echoes of the past. Carlos climbed the metal stairs that led to the second floor. The sound of the knocking intensified, but it was irregular, as if someone was trying to get attention. However, when he reached the top floor, he found no one. The rooms were in ruins, and the doors hung ajar, revealing rusted beds and old wheelchairs abandoned in the corners. As he walked through the corridors, the lights from his flashlight began to flicker. He stopped in front of a room where, for some reason, time seemed to have stopped. Everything inside was in place, untouched, as if someone was still there. The name on the door indicated the room had belonged to a patient named Elias. However, the name had been violently scratched out. When he entered, Carlos felt a pressure in the air, as if something invisible was watching him. He found a notebook on the bed, filled with notes written in trembling handwriting. "I no longer remember who I am. They say I'm Elias, but it doesn't feel right. Sometimes, I hear voices calling me by another name, but I can't remember." Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. The voices of the forgotten. Suddenly, the knocking resumed, this time louder and closer. Carlos tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the asylum was alive, trapping him inside. The walls began to emit a low sound, almost imperceptible, like whispers coming from all directions. The sound of voices, but not just any voices, they were ancient, as if belonging to people who had forgotten how to speak. He tried to stay calm and focused on what they were saying. The voices seemed to be calling him, asking for help, but at the same time confused, as if they didn't know who he was. "You've forgotten too, we've all forgotten," one of the voices murmured. He saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, distorted figures walking slowly, aimlessly, as if trapped in an eternal cycle of disorientation. Carlos grabbed his notebook and frantically wrote down what was happening. The knocking on the walls now seemed to come from within them. He knew he was in danger, but he also knew he had to uncover what had happened to the patients there. Through more notes he found, he began to piece together a dark puzzle. Many of the asylum's patients had suffered from a strange affliction that gradually erased their memories, until nothing remained. But something else was at play, something related to secret experiments conducted by the doctors. The forgotten experiment. Carlos finally reached the old psychiatric wing, where the experiments had supposedly taken place. The place was completely disfigured by time, but traces of what had happened still lingered. There were documents hidden between the walls, revealing that the doctors had been trying to find a way to cleanse the patients' minds, believing they could cure them by erasing their traumatic memories. However, something had gone wrong. The patients didn't just lose their memories, they lost the essence of who they were. Their souls remained trapped in the asylum, wandering through the halls, forgotten and without identity. Carlos began to feel the effects of this himself. He looked at his reflection in a broken piece of glass and, for a moment, didn't recognize who he was. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadows moved faster, surrounding him. He ran for the exit, but the asylum didn't want to let him leave. The building seemed to contract around him, the walls growing narrower. When he finally managed to open the front door, the voices screamed his name, but it wasn't the name he knew. Carlos ran out, but with the feeling that he had left something important behind. Back at home, Carlos tried to return to his normal life, but the echoes of the asylum still haunted him. At night, he heard the knocking on the walls and the whispers returned. He knew that, in some way, he was now part of the asylum of the forgotten. Every day, he lost a little more of his memories. And one day, when he looked in the mirror, he no longer knew who he was. Story 10, The Circus of Shadows. There's something mysterious about circuses. They appear and disappear, bringing temporary joy that always hides something darker. Today, we will tell the story of a circus that appeared in a small town, but this was no ordinary circus. Its attractions were bizarre, and its audience never left. The arrival of the circus. When the Circus of Shadows arrived in town, no one knew where it came from. It appeared overnight in an empty field on the outskirts of town, with colorful tents and flickering lights. The poster advertised mysterious and extraordinary attractions. The townspeople, curious and eager for something to break the monotony of their routine, were immediately drawn to it. Juliana and her group of friends were the first in line. They had grown up in the town and had never seen anything so grand. The tent seemed larger on the inside than on the outside, and the sound of laughter and music echoed everywhere. But there was something strange in the air. As they moved through the entrance, Juliana noticed the laughter sounded distorted, as if coming from far away, and the shadows inside the tent seemed to move erratically. The sinister attractions. The group decided to watch the main show. When they entered the largest tent, they saw something they would never forget. The ringmaster, a tall, slender figure with a wide, unsettling smile, welcomed the audience. He wore a shining black suit, and his face seemed to change as the light hit him, as if his appearance was unstable. The attractions began. Each one was more bizarre than the last. There was a woman who transformed into different animals, a man who seemed to walk among the shadows and disappear completely, and a child who floated in the air, with pitch-black eyes. Juliana and her friends began to feel uncomfortable, realizing something was wrong. But the audience seemed enchanted, as if they were hypnotized. No one blinked, no one moved. It was as if they were trapped in the show. Juliana tried to leave, but she realized the tent doors were locked. She looked at her friends and noticed they were changing, their expressions were frozen, their bodies immobile. The price of curiosity desperate, Juliana tried to find another way out, but every door she opened led her back to the same place. The shadows of the attractions began to approach the audience, stretching like dark tentacles. She saw her friends being pulled into the shadows, their bodies gradually disappearing until only their shadows remained, now part of the show. She ran through the narrow corridors between the tents, hearing the circus music echoing all around her. The laughter had turned into muffled screams, and Juliana began to realize the circus wasn't meant to entertain, it was a trap. Every person who entered was absorbed by the circus, becoming part of the attractions, their shadows forever trapped in that place. Juliana tried to find the ringmaster, believing he held the answers. When she finally confronted him, he only smiled sinisterly and said, "Everyone becomes part of the show in the end." She realized that, like her friends, she too was starting to disappear. Her shadow stretched out, as if it was being pulled into the depths of the circus. The final show, Juliana realized she was becoming part of the spectacle. Her legs grew heavy, as if her own shadow was taking control of her body. She looked down and saw that her shadow was no longer just a reflection of herself, it moved on its own, stretching and pulling her toward the center of the arena. She tried to fight, but the more she resisted, the more the shadow consumed her. Her hands were now transparent, as if her existence was being erased. The ringmaster kept laughing, his voice echoing through the tent like a distorted, omnipresent sound. "You're part of the show now, Juliana. We all are. And we never leave." The other spectators, once frozen, began to disappear, one by one, leaving only their shadows, which now moved freely through the tent. The music sped up, in sync with Juliana's heartbeat, and she knew her time was running out. The only way to stop it would be to end the show. She dragged herself to the center of the stage, where the spotlight focused on the ringmaster. Juliana knew that the light was the key. The shadows avoided the light, and the ringmaster seemed more vulnerable under the intense brightness. With the last of her strength, she pushed one of the giant lamps toward the ringmaster, who, when hit by the light, screamed in pain. His body began to disintegrate into a mass of shadows trying desperately to flee from the light. The circus of lost souls. The ringmaster's collapse triggered a chain reaction. The shadows of the other spectators began to free themselves from the circus's control. The tent trembled, and the lights flickered frantically. Juliana felt her shadow retreat, as if it was dissolving along with the circus's hold on her. With the ringmaster gone, the music stopped abruptly. The tents began to disintegrate, turning to dust that the wind carried away. However, before she could feel completely free, Juliana realized that the circus wasn't just an illusion, it existed in a kind of parallel plane. What she had destroyed was only a manifestation, a part of something much larger. The shadows were still there, watching her, waiting for her to make the next mistake. And though the ringmaster had disappeared, the feeling that something much worse was lurking remained. Juliana finally managed to leave the field where the circus had been set up. When she looked back, there was nothing there, as if the circus had never existed. She returned to town, exhausted, but with a sense of relief. Her friends, however, were never seen again. Everyone believed they had simply run away, but Juliana knew the truth. The following nights were quiet. Life seemed to return to normal. However, one night, while she slept, Juliana heard music in the distance, the same melody from the circus. When she opened her eyes, she noticed her shadow moving strangely, slowly separating itself from her body. The circus, somehow, was still inside her, and her shadow was the ticket back. She understood then that the circus of shadows never really disappeared. It lived inside those who dared to challenge it. And once marked, you were never truly free. If you've made it this far, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with all the news. See you in the next video.